Burning Issy, Melvin Burgess, Chapter 10, Part 1. I was to have a new life after all. Nat didn't trust Ayahan, but I thought she was wonderful. She'd saved me from guilt. She'd cured my burn, and she was so brimming over with life and fun. I told myself not to be so pleased about it, that Nat knew best, that I was leaving my family behind, that I was going off with a stranger who knew the ways of the witches. But it made no difference. Ayahan had melted me. I just wanted to smile every time she came into the room. I'd fallen in love with her. She was in a great hurry to get away, and we left first thing the next morning. Gil was asleep, still very weak from his illness, but Nat got up and cut us some bread. "I'll send word to you if I can," he said. "Come back to us, won't you, Izzy?" I nodded and felt like crying. He wanted to change the dressing on my arm, but Ayahan said she'd done it earlier. Nat gave me a funny look, but he didn't press. Then he kissed me goodbye, and we set off across the wooden bridge over the stream behind the house, past the little coppice that shielded us from the wind and provided our firewood, and up over the hills toward the Hebden Bridge. The ground was still very wet underfoot, but a brisk wind was beginning to dry the wet leaves and the grass. We'd been out of the house for no more than a couple of minutes when the first strange thing happened. We were walking out from the coppice into the fields when a tiny black figure ran helter-skelter out of the bushes and stopped in the road, shrieking angrily at Ayahan in no language I'd ever heard. He was no more than a few centimetres high, and I was so shocked that I screamed in alarm. "Get away with you," Ayahan said quietly, and suddenly it was nothing more or less to do than a blackbird which had jumped out of the bushes to scold us. Now it flew off into a tree, and I could hear it calling in alarm. Ayahan turned to smile at me, and then carried on up the hill. I just stood there, my heart beating away from the shock. I heard feet, and Nat ran up behind me. "What is it?" I thought I saw something. Poor Nat was ready to fight a dragon for me. At that second I brimmed over with love for him. We stood looking at each other for a moment, and I was ready to run back into his arms. But then I heard Ayahan call, and already on her way up the hill, and I turned without thinking and ran after her. When I looked back a dozen or steps further on, he'd already gone. The way was slippery with the mud from all the rain, and we worked our way slowly up towards the top without a word. I was sleepy when we set out, but now my mind was racing. Surely the blackbird was just my mind playing tricks, but I wasn't sure. Ayahan had plenty of mysteries about her, and I began to realise I had 1,000 questions to ask. When we got near the top of the hill and the ground levelled out, I ran up to catch up with her to ask her something about that had been on my mind ever since the first walk through the door. She first walked through the door. Sorry. Ian. She stopped and let me draw level. "How did you know I was in trouble?" I begged. She leaned confidently over to me. "My imp told me," she whispered. I must have looked terrified, because her eyebrows shot up with delight and roared with laughter. "Codswallop," she shouted, and roared with laughter again, just as the sound of that word. She lifted her hands to her face and shouted, "Codswallop," again and again, up to the sky, and over the dales, and over to Pendle Hill, lying like a great animal on the horizon of us. "Codswallop, Codswallop," she yelled, laughing and gurgling like a drain, until I began to laugh too, and I shouted it for her, "Codswallop, Codswallop," over and over until we were both so sick of laughing. When at last we had stopped, she rubbed her sides and complained she hurt so much from laughing. She said we mustn't do that too often, or we'll have no strength for the walk. Then she added, sometimes I just know things are about people, especially people I care for. She raised her eyebrows at me, and then at me and stuck her stick in the ground, and we carried on toiling slowly up the wet hill. Our walk began under a bright sky and a cool wind, perfect weather for walking, but the ground underfoot was sodden, and we were often struggling in the mud. We might have to lift a wagon up to the roads below, or just rivers of the mud at this time of year, but I had preferred to stick to the footpaths. When we passed above a big road, we could see the wagons up to their axles in the mud, the horses and mules slipping and slithering and sitting down, their legs and flanks covered as if they had swum in it. The paths across the hills and the dales were too narrow and too high for the wagons to pass, but even these were often calf deep in wet, sticky mud. Most people had to walk if they wanted to get anywhere, and by spring, after a wet winter, the paths were little more than bogs. My boots were soon great balls of mud. Some of the ways were used by pack horses carrying goods to and fro across the dales. The powerful, steady Galloway horses used to work. For this work, carried out everything on their backs across the moors: coal, stone, iron, fleeces. But their commonest load was lime from the quarries of Clitheroe, and we were so used to seeing the white, lime-dusted rows of horses snaking their way along the valley sides that they were known locally as the Lime Gals. They made the ways impassable, and we footwalkers set up a separate path for ourselves to one side of the main passage. Excuse me. Although I saw nothing strange after the first vision of the coppice, I had very made odd remarks to the things of the countryside around her. It's all very well for you, she said at one point as we crossed over a boggy patch of land on a high hill. I looked up to see who she was talking to, but there was nothing there but a bright green patch of moss on one side of the path. I prefer it a bit drier myself, she added, nodding in a friendly manner at the moss before she carried on. I thought it was just her sense of humour, except she wasn't laughing. And other times we began to climb up to the moors. After Marsden village, she began a conversation with a clump of heather. That's bad luck, she remarked suddenly. What is? I asked. She pointed to the heather. It's the white flower type, she said, adding to the heather. You'll just have to live with it. I looked doubtfully at the plant, which didn't look any different from the other heather to me. It wasn't in flower. I asked her how she knew it was white one. It told me, said Irehan, smiling. I thought she might shouting codswallop again, but she didn't, she didn't add anything and began to walk off. But I thought white heather was supposed to be lucky, I panted, struggling to keep up with her. Not for the heather it isn't, pointed out Irehan. She smiled and chuckled. Right next to the footpath too. It's always getting picked. The poor thing hasn't set seed in 4 years. These events made me even more curious. Irehan kept a good pace, and I didn't have to much breath for questions. When I didn't ask, she always managed to put me off, saying there was plenty of time for that later on, or walking faster and faster. I had to put up with that, but she couldn't stop me thinking. Shortly after lunch I remembered something that stopped me dead in my tracks. Ayhan was walking rapidly along a stony little path by a brook and didn't seem to notice how stuck I was. Ayhan, I shouted. She took no notice at all and began to disappear around the corner. I yelled, Ayhan! Again and ran after her, really angry with her for ignoring me. She turned and waited for me. Are you? I drew up to her, but I felt foolish suddenly. Well? Are you my mother? Your mother? Her eyebrows shot up. Why should you think that? I had remembered what old Demdike said about the time by the fire, that my name was Estelle. And your name is Estelle too, isn't it? I said. Demdike knows a little of something and a lot of nothing. She knows of me, and she knows my name, and she wanted to impress you. Your name isn't Estelle, nothing like it. As for me, I'm a widow Estelle. My husband Tom Estelle died 5 years ago. She smiled sadly, and then turned round to continue walking. I paused for a moment before realising that she had still told me nothing of what I really wanted to know. Myself. Then what have you got to do with me? I demanded. Ayhan shrugged and carried on walking. Ayhan! I was infuriated. Ayhan! I want to know. Where did I come from? I don't know anything about myself. What happened to Mother? Who am I? I wailed in tears of frustration. She turned to face me. You know, she said. But I don't know. I don't know anything. I stamped my foot. I was so cross and splattered us both with muddy water. Ayhan ignored the mud and stared intently at me. You know, she insisted. You told me yourself. When? How? I don't understand. I don't remember anything. I won't tell you anything. Nothing at all, she promised. But I will help you remember. End of chapter 10, part 1.